Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Brendan O'Reilly. I'm the president of the Press Club of Long Island, and this is the Post-COVID Newsroom. The Press Club of Long Island is the Long Island chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. We are advocates for journalism and the First Amendment in general. We are professionals as well as students, and we put on events like this because we want to advance the principles of journalism, but we also want to think about practical things like what about the safety of people who are in this profession? And our panelists are going to shed light on that today. Moderating the discussion is Scott Brinton. He is a Press Club of Long Island past president and a Long Island Journalism Hall of Fame inductee. Scott is the executive editor of the 18th edition Herald Community Newspapers and an adjunct professor of journalism at Hofstra University. He's also freelance for the New York Times and Newsday. At Hofstra, he is the co-director of the High School Summer Journalism Institute, which focuses on increasing diversity in the newsroom. Scott, please take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Brendan. I am very honored to be here with such an esteemed panel. We have three amazing people on our panel tonight, and I just want to introduce them before we get going on the question and answer portion of this. We have Zachary Dowdy. He's an assistant professor at Stony Brook University School of Communication and Journalism. Before joining SBU as a full-time professor in 2020, right amid the pandemic, he worked as a rewrite and criminal justice reporter and United Nations correspondent for Newsday. He's also worked for the Boston Herald and the Boston Globe, where he covered urban affairs, international issues, and criminal justice. And he is now vice president of the editorial unit of Local 406, the union representing employees at Newsday. So welcome, Zach. Audrey Gruber is vice president of news for News 12 Networks, where she oversees operations, personnel, and overall network efficiency. She previously served as vice president of original news production and development at Spectrum, the head of video at the Daily Mail, senior investigative producer at Al Jazeera, executive producer at Fuse, and various production positions at CBS, NBC, CNN, and ABC. So clearly, Audrey has worked a lot of places. Just wondering if there's any place you haven't worked. Aaron Glatt, Dr. Aaron Glatt, I should say, very esteemed doctor and researcher. He is chairman of medicine and chief of infectious diseases and hospital epidemiologist at Mount Sinai South Nassau and a full professor of medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. He's a spokesperson for the Infectious Diseases Society of America. He's board certified in internal medicine and infectious diseases. He was recently awarded the 2020 New York American College of Physicians Laureate Award and was named a master of the American College of Physicians. So clearly, we're talking to the right people tonight for this subject that we're going to be undertaking tonight, which is the post-COVID newsroom. Now, I should note that we originally planned this back in October. We thought of this idea. We wanted to talk about what would happen after the pandemic, with the expectation that somehow, and maybe this was idealistic of us or naive of us, but we had thought we would be out of the pandemic, at least partially by now. Clearly, that's not the case, although the infection rate here on Long Island does appear to be dropping. So I guess I want to start off with Zach and as a union representative and Audrey as a newsroom producer. What's the state of your newsrooms right now? I can tell you at the Herald where I'm at, we are out of the office. I've been out of the office for 2 years. We went back for 2 weeks back in December, and that quickly got shut down after 5 members of our staff came down with COVID. So what's the state of your newsrooms at the moment? Why don't we start with Zach?
Well, I think at Newsday, the same is true, Scott. We are not, and I say we because I'm still involved in Newsday, even though I'm not working there full time anymore. But the newsroom is operating remote like everyone else is. There's a there's a sense of malaise, I think sometimes. There's a lot of sense of being overworked. There's a sense of isolation and being kind of atomized. So the morale in some aspects is kind of low. We all want the end of this to occur. Although I think there's a lot of a sense that, well, it's okay to work from home. And the one thing that we're able to witness is that these organizations can have remote operations. And maybe there's some sort of hybrid that can be, we can sort of adopt for all newsrooms going into the future. Whereas Newsday and other organizations were loath to allow that in the past, they see that it actually still can work with under the right conditions. But I think there's a lower sense of morale these days because people feel so isolated and they feel like operating in a pandemic has been really, really taxing at this point. And I think, and I'm sure if everyone here has heard about the incident that happened in West Virginia just last night. There was a reporter who was doing a live shot, and she was covering a water main break. And while she was covering it, of course, it was dark and kind of difficult conditions, hazardous conditions. She was actually struck by a car while she was on the air, talking to the anchor. And this was just sort of an illustration of how somebody who's working in the field, doing everything by herself, that's sort of a sign of the times. That was almost, we're getting to that point pre-COVID anyway, but now it's become even worse, where everyone is operating and doing 5 or 6 different jobs that they hadn't done before. So there's a sense of being overworked, isolated, et cetera, and just concerned about the future and hoping that the quality of their work actually remains high.
Okay, so I want to return to that idea of being overworked in a minute after we hear about News 12. But I definitely want to know, like, what do we do about that? And maybe there's not a good definitive answer to that because it's hard, but yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. So just Audrey, in terms of your newsroom, or your newsrooms, because you oversee multiple newsrooms, where are you at?
We had gone to return, we had planned on a return to work in November. We returned to work in November, and then Omicron hit. And it was fast and furious. And we had been taking a slow go approach to the return to work from the beginning, only returning, essential tiers in slow amounts to try to prevent spread. We thought we were in a good place with the vaccines. We at Altice had to come to a conclusion where we gave people, if you were fully vaccinated, meaning double vaccinated, you would have one set of rules. Your health, if you weren't double vaccinated, you had to pay extra on your health insurance, but it was up to you to make that choice. We decided after Omicron started spreading that we needed to do something immediately, and we returned to work from home. We are now work from home. We need directors. We need a small group to be to actually be in the studios, but it's a very small amount that are actually in studio. And we are work from home until February 28th. Over the time of that we made this decision, at one point between November and I think probably about a week ago, we had closed approximately, don't quote me on it because it changes and this is a little old, 27 newsrooms to be cleaned. So when we got a positive, we'd have to close down the newsrooms and send all that production somewhere else or do a repeat, because our employees' health is the #1 concern. And so we do a complete cleaning from top to bottom. With a lot of work from home employees, that wasn't the case. At the height, last week, Chris, you can correct me if I'm giving the wrong numbers, Chris Beccaro, who also works at News 12 and has heard me give this many times, so can correct me if I'm wrong. We had 48 people out at one point, either being isolated or putting on quarantine because they were exposed or they had COVID at one point during the past 4 weeks, including myself, who worked with COVID, who got COVID and had to quarantine and gave it to my entire family from being in the office. You don't know where you got it from, but simply for being in the office. We are now down to less than a dozen. So we've seen it begin to go down, but we are not going to return to the office until we feel comfortable that we can keep our employees safe. We also issued all across the line, everybody had to wear masks, socially distanced, even in the studios. We had work from home facilities for some of our on-air people, and some of our on-air people who were immunocompromised and it wasn't safe for them, we allowed them to work from home. So we had to figure out how to get all that equipment to people. and make sure that their internet will hold up even when because weather's a big part of our coverage. So even in the weather, we've learned how to do things differently than ever before. I am on mask patrol constantly with people and trying to get them upgraded masks. No eating in the control room, no eating together. I mean, the problem, I think that the hardest part is that this is a pandemic, and it's not just what people do at home, at work, but it's also what they do at home. I can't deal with that risk. I can't tell you not to see your family. That's not within my rights. And so what we saw was people, even so, we are 93% vaccinated, double vaccinated at News 12, but I can't guarantee what people do in their private lives. And that's the part of this that's so difficult. I can be careful in the newsroom. I can sanitize all I want, but you're going home and your kids go to school. My kids go to school. They come back. They're not, the mask use isn't so great. They're not testing all the time. It goes through wildfire. So I think that's the hardest part about keeping our newsroom safe, is that we're also humans and we have families and lives, and you're not in a jail cell with it. So it's navigating through all of that while keeping our viewers informed, which is the biggest part of all this, because we still have people need to know what's going on in their communities. So it's servicing the employees, servicing our viewers, and finding a middle ground to make it all work and stay safe.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Glatt, so is there any sense, obviously there's a lot of anxiety about going back to work in person. Is there any sense of when it will be quote unquote safe? And I'm saying quote unquote because I guess there's no really surety these days about what exactly safe is. Is there any sense on what would be advisable to newsrooms, because there are a number of newsroom decision makers here with us tonight, when it might be advisable to go back, and when they go back, what should they be doing in order to stay safe?
Sure. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. I don't know what you're all worried about going back to work. I've been working every single day for the last 2 years.
That's true.
It's been pretty much the same thing, going into the hospital every day. No, in all seriousness, I fully understand the concerns that people have. And you're not trained in appropriate infection control. You've all become somewhat expert at it over this past 2 years period of time. And even in the hospital, where people are fully trained and they're fit tested for appropriate personal protective equipment, and they're very much used to going into rooms of patients with contagion and are on the front lines and willing to put themselves at risk. You all know the tremendous number of healthcare workers that got ill originally. And I have, unfortunately, colleagues and friends both at Mount Sinai South Nassau and other institutions that died from COVID, from exposures in taking care of patients. And we all, unfortunately, know right now with Omicron how difficult it is for hospitals, Mount Sinai South Nassau amongst them, to staff, because our staff are no different than you. They have lives outside of the hospital, even though we try not to let them have lives outside the hospital. And even though they're somewhat familiar, obviously, with the risks, and are, doctors and nurses and other highly trained professionals that understand fully the risks, I want to hug my grandchildren, and I have, and that's a potential risk. They're all out there in the real world, and they're in schools, and they're potentially exposed, and they're like normal healthy kids, have runny noses, and it's very difficult to eliminate risk from your life. So what I've tried to teach, and what I try to practice, and what I try to tell people to do is don't let perfect be the reason that you don't do a pretty good job. If you can't do it perfect, don't throw up your hands and say, well, that's it. I did get an exposure there, so forget it. I'm giving up all of this, good, practical, scientifically based ways to limit my exposure, and forget about it. And there are people that say, well, if I can't guarantee that I'm not going to get it, well, I might as well just go forward and do whatever I want. And that's obviously not smart. It's not intelligent. And what I try to tell people to do is to practice what I call intelligent infection control with COVID, intelligent masking, intelligent distancing, intelligent ways to protect yourself. The first and simplest is get vaccinated. For those of you that got vaccinated, kudos, but now get boosted. If you're more than 5 months after your last mRNA vaccine, get boosted. I got boosted and vaccinated the first second I could. every single child in my family, with no exceptions, and every single grandchild in my family, with no exceptions, who was at the age of being able to get vaccinated. Grandpa has a pretty strong influence on them, and every single one has gotten vaccinated. And that's, people ask me, oh, how could you do that to your 5-year-old grandchild? And I said, because I love them. Because I love them. I do believe in science. I'm a scientist. I've spent 40 years practicing and dealing with infectious diseases. And the way out of this pandemic is by using scientific evidence-based medicine. Do we know everything? Absolutely not. Have we made horrible mistakes? Absolutely not. I gave grand rounds at my hospital in January 2020 on COVID. There wasn't a single case yet in the United States, but I was intrigued by what we were seeing from Wuhan. I had all the data from the Chinese literature that had been published at that point in time. And I gave grand rounds in January 2020. And I distinctly remember telling everybody, don't go out and buy masks to wear in the street. It's crazy. You'd have to be nuts to wear a mask in the street. They're going to be all contaminated. You're going to put it back in your pocket and you're going to contaminate yourself. You'll contaminate other people. And that's probably the worst piece of advice I could have given to people. If I knew then what I knew now, I think we would have saved many more lives. But that's science. Science doesn't claim to know all the answers. And when I give a talk, when I educate people, I tell them, make sure you know the date of my talk. Some people sometimes throw back things that I said, 6 months ago, a year ago, and they say, well, look, you were so wrong. Then I said, no, I'm wrong now, but I was right then. Good science is only as good as the information that we have. In the 50s and 60s, they kept people in a dark room after they had a heart attack and said, don't do anything, rest and relax. We do the exact opposite today. We used to treat people with ulcers by giving them milk and giving them all sorts of antacids. That's not the right treatment for an ulcer. So medicine changes. So why anybody would think that the information that we had in January, February, March of 2020 is still right or correct and should be followed religiously is just wrong. Medicine changes, evidence medicine changes. There's a paper that I read today that is going to make us change a policy that was put into effect previously. So we're constantly looking for new information. And I tell you, practically speaking, there are ways to make a newsroom as safe as possible. But again, if you're not absolutely required to do something, as we are in a hospital, we can't say everybody go home and come back in a few weeks and we'll pick up where we left off. You may be able to function from home for certain things. You may be able to limit the number of people that need to be in a newsroom. Okay, it's not 100%, but maybe 20% is an adequate number. The rest can work at home. Maybe there are ways that you can change the work habits that you have to allow for a safer environment. But the key word there is safer environment. I don't think any of us want to go live in a bubble. I don't think any one of us want to stay at home and not encounter any other human beings. I mean, back in March and April of 2020, it was a ghost town. People were not getting together with their children, not getting together with their parents. Everybody, family unit, they stayed in their own house. They were scared to venture outside. Outside's actually one of the safest places. God's filtration system beats a HEPA filter and a MERV 16 every day. So being outside is actually one of the best and safest places to be. Having social events, cultural events, religious events outdoors is a great way to keep people safe and yet have that collegiality, that lack of isolation. It's not always possible. You can't do certain things outside in Long Island in January 20th. You can't do that. It's too cold. It's not possible. But where possible, things can be done in a safer way, outdoors versus indoors. A larger ventilated room with people spaced, masked or not masked, versus a tightly packed table. Everybody used to sit around the table and eat and have your news meetings or whatever meetings you'd have to kick over what should the opinion of the op-ed page be and what items are going to make the first page and the second page and what's not going to get put into today's film. Well, maybe you do that from a little bit of a distance. Maybe those types of discussions are better for a Zoom conference. Maybe there are certain things that will say, yes, that's an in-person event. This is not an in-person event. I don't believe in blanket rules. I don't like saying this is the way you have to do it, absolute, because you'll end up probably being wrong. Whereas if you do things intelligently, if you look at each case individually, just like I try to look at each patient individually, we don't give every patient with COVID the same medication. You look at underlying risk factors, you look at all sorts of other variables. So too, whenever you're talking about work-related advice, you have to look at the need for the people to be together. What are acceptable risks to take in that situation? Is everybody vaccinated? That will certainly help, but you're going to get Omicron at least as a very mild illness or maybe as a asymptomatic illness, but you could be transmitting it to other people even if you're triply vaccinated. Omicron is so contagious, and the way vaccines work, the biggest mistake that we as the press, I'll now say, because as a spokesperson, I sometimes will be giving information and not in the best possible way. The biggest mistake we've made is to talk about vaccine breakthroughs like that was a problem. We should have said, we expect to get vaccine breakthroughs because that's normal. What we do expect is that those people won't get very sick. And we were 100% right if we'd given that message, because the people that are triply vaccinated, they got their 2 doses of their mRNA vaccine, then got a booster, they're not the ones in my ICU. They're not the ones that are dying. They're not the ones that are critically ill. But that message, well, I got COVID anyway. I got Omicron anyway. Why did I bother getting vaccinated when all that stuff on the internet tells me how dangerous it is to get vaccinated? So that message we messed up on. We as a collective, we didn't get out the right message. And that sometimes is our worst enemy. The respect that people had for the CDC, the FDA, for science in 2019 versus 2021, 2022, maybe that's a good thing for our Truth in Medicine poll the next time to see how much science has lost respect in the eyes of people. When I was growing up, the doctor, wow, that was the greatest profession you could possibly be, next to journalism. But you
neck and neck.
You looked up to your doctor. Today, everybody's making fun of Fauci. Everybody's making fun of the CDC. These are huge, brilliant scientists who've devoted their lives to making people healthier and better. But we've lost that respect in people's eyes, and that's because we haven't gotten sometimes the message out as accurately as we would like.
Okay, thank you. So Zach and Audrey, in terms of your newsrooms, I mean, Zach, you mentioned a little bit earlier the sense of malaise that many
Yes.
are feeling, the challenge of being alone for months on end, oftentimes working as a lone wolf in a profession where it's a very collaborative profession, journalism. So what do you do to overcome it? How do you overcome it? And I know that's not an easy answer, and I know there may not be an answer, but what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think people use whatever interpersonal relations that they have already in the newsroom to try to overcome that sense of isolation and being, the sense of being alone. But it's difficult to overcome. You are going to be alone for a good chunk of your day, unless of course you live with someone, and they're also working from remote. So I imagine that there are a number of different coping mechanisms. I imagine that there are people taking breaks and going out and seeing other people when they have time. Some people are probably working from outside in cars and the like, especially those who do have to still travel to some locations. But I'm not certain that there is, a sort of one size fits all type solution to that. I imagine that there are a number of customized kinds of approaches to trying to ameliorate that sense of isolation and sense of detachment from the newsroom. As you mentioned, newsrooms are, we like them because they're so bustling. They have a lot of different exchanges of ideas and jokes and a whole lot of sharing of information. And I think a lot of us got into the profession partly because of that. You may have visited a newsroom when you were in high school or you worked in a college newsroom, and you like that just sense of energy. And working late at night and having working on a project together, that's completely shattered at this time. So hopefully we can get back to some sense of that pretty soon. But I imagine folks are really at a loss for how to duplicate in any way approximate that sense of satisfaction that came from working with colleagues, side by side. So there's some people who are journalists who are in the call today, and hopefully we can share some notes about what they are doing to try to to end that sense, and then lessen that sense of malaise and isolation.
Okay, thank you. Audrey, what is your sense there? How do we overcome that sense of isolation, if you will?
I think we're in a little bit, or I'm in a little bit of a different situation, because in TV and in most of our stations, we've got a cameraman and a reporter going out together. So they're still going out together. We've gone in the state, many of our stations, we've partnered people up so they were married, so that they sort of bubbled together, married in the term of TV terms. They have their own, we're not creating marriages, really. That's a whole different show.
Well,
But
sometimes, right?
in our newsroom, apparently, yes. There are a lot of News 12 marriages out there that I've learned in my time. But we've married people together, and then sometimes they travel separately to the events. Cars have become the new workstations. I think a positive that has come out of it for us is that we've learned different ways of getting out there. So instead of everybody coming to around that table, which we miss, and talking about their stories and then being launched from the main station, we're now doing that call over Zoom, but our reporters and our photogs are usually on their way already to the location. They are being launched from their homes or from wherever they are. So it actually saves them time. They don't have to go all the way to the station and then back out past their house. So that's been a positive that we've learned from it. And we have a whole bunch of different jobs. So that's the reporter photographer job, when they're together. We do have some people who are in the bureau who are bureaus at different places. We have a handful of MMJs. They operate on their own a little bit. And editors live in dark rooms, and now they're in their house, and there is that missing of running into the field. I'll tell you, I miss the running out with, I got a story, and that sort of energy. You have to make an appointment to have a phone call. But we have a real mixed bag with the News 12 stations, because some people are still operating, being out there, and we're public facing all the time because we have to get the interview on tape. Now, the challenge is that if I want to do something in Broadway, I have to make sure the entire crew has a PCR test within 24 hours. No home testing for that.
Mhm.
I don't know if a lot of you have gone to some city officials have mandated testing as well to go in, or showing your vaccine cards, and that has changed. But we're still public facing, but we have to ask the public to stay 6 feet apart from us. And so we had to change. It was a boom mic now instead of lobbing them up. So those sorts of things have changed. The malaise now at my level, I feel like, because I can't go to stations right now. And I'm at home a lot, and I do love my kids, but it's a lot, and we have a lot of people trying to manage the newsroom and manage their kids that are home because they've been exposed to COVID, they've gone remote. There's a lot of stress on our employees to have for their home life. Again, it's the home life that COVID takes part of, that comes into the workplace as well. Not just the I'm at home working, but I'm at home and I still have to manage my family, and my husband's here too, and my kids are here, and it's a lot going on. And I hear the isolation part. I don't want to also forget that it's the overwhelming part of having all of that around you 24/7 that we're dealing with. And it's talking to your employees and giving them that time, which is managers too. We're taking on that role of a psychologist to give them that time. And that's building into our days, and we have lives, so it's a continuing piling on that this pandemic brings as we all try to navigate it, not just being isolated, but you're isolated if you have a family, managing all that family. And if you're alone, being isolated alone. So there's a lot this brings to it. And I think we just have to listen more. That's one of the things we're supposed to be good at as journalists, is listening and taking that in. And I think we have to do that as those of us who are managers. And even those of us who are just reporters, is listening to our subjects too, because even though you're an expert in COVID, you're also got a family and a grandkids and everybody else you're worried about too. And all that. So our subjects are also going under undue stress in this time as well.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I think it's certainly helpful, obviously, for folks to hear that, because we've got a myriad of newsrooms here, that we're all going through the same thing here, and that we're in this together. Dr. Glatt, journalists go out into the field a lot. Even though a lot of us can work from home, and a lot of us do work from home, but they spend a tremendous amount of time out in the field. One question that comes to mind is, a year ago, people were very diligent, it seems to me, about the notion of social distancing, masking up, and there's a lot of fatigue around that. So a lot of people aren't doing that anymore. And here in Nassau County, they're no longer required to do that in public spaces, which creates a challenge unto itself. What should journalists be doing when they go out into the field to stay safe these days? Is there anything different than they have been doing so far? But is there any specific recommendations that you might be able to offer them?
Sure. So again, I don't want to repeat myself, but the single most important thing anybody can do is to make sure that you're fully vaccinated. And by that, I mean having a booster as well. If you've gotten the 2 mRNA vaccines, get that booster if it's more than 5 months. There's no need for a 4th shot at this time. Everybody's worried, well, I'm going to have to do this every 3 months. Nobody's saying that you have to do this every 3 months, every year, every 6 months. Right now, the data are very good that having 3 doses of the vaccine will prevent you from getting serious illness with the previous variants, with Delta, and with Omicron. That's the single most important thing you do for your own personal health, as well as for the health of everyone around you. You may still get COVID. That's why we'll talk about other things you can do, but you're not going to get seriously ill. If I had told you 5 years ago that you're going to go out in this winter and you're going to do 5 times, you're going to get some viral illness because of all the contacts you have with people and all the meetings you have, you'd say, okay, that's a part of my job. I accept that. I'm hoping we're getting to the point. We're not maybe there fully yet, but if you're a relatively healthy person, and by that I mean you're not severely immunocompromised and you've been triply vaccinated, you're really not going to get seriously ill from Omicron or from hopefully any other strain of COVID at this point in time. So that's the first and most important thing. I don't like to repeat myself, but when people ask me, what can I do? Well, I should wear an N95, I'll wear 2 N95s. That's a minuscule value compared to getting vaccinated. Assuming we're all vaccinated and boosted and we're in the optimal, scientifically based way that we can keep ourselves healthy. So then we try to minimize risk. If you're in an outdoor event, much less risk. If you're in an indoor event, well, are you in a large venue and you're really not crowded with other people and there's a pretty good ventilation system, so that risk is lower. If you have to be packed in with other people, you're in the middle of a crowd and you're the news person in the crowd of January 1 and they're dropping the ball and you're packed in like sardines. Well, then, it's going to be very difficult for me to tell you that you're going to be very safe if you're indoors in a setting like that. But certainly, I would tell you to wear an N95. Now, we didn't make that recommendation you should wear an N95 in the past, but I think it's reasonable if a person wishes to take an additional layer, either wear 2 layers of masks. And when I say mask, I preferably mean a mask that is a 3-ply type of surgical mask, wearing 2 of them. And again, they're not all the same. You want to make a tight fit around your mouth. So wrap it around your ears, twist it around your ears. You don't have to just loop it, you can twist it. If you twist it, it will tighten up. This is the area here where the air is coming in. The air is not going through the mask. The masks are pretty good. They talk about that candle test. See if you can blow out a candle with your mask. You can't blow out a candle with wearing a regular surgical mask. It's impossible because most of the air is blocked. It just comes in on the side. So if you can tighten that up, and everybody's facial features are different, having a beard a little bit bushier than mine is going to make it difficult to make a good fit. I don't tell people that they have to shave. In the hospital, I tell people if you want to make a good fit with an N95, you better either trim your beard or shave. So that's a personal decision, which we don't necessarily, demand people do that. But I point out what the educational value is of my statement, that the tighter the fit you make, the better the mask will be. An N95 is a better mask, but not if you don't wear it properly. And if your facial features are that the mask is either too small or too big for you, you may not be really getting much more benefit than from wearing a regular surgical mask. To wear an N95 for a long period of time is uncomfortable. There are different types of N95s. Maybe wear one that is more like the duckbill N95, which I personally find more comfortable than the very, tight-fitting, or you can't hear a word that I'm saying, type of a mask, which, if you've taken a fit test, that's a very good seal. We walk into rooms with patients with Ebola with those type of masks on. We walk into rooms throughout my career with patients with, tuberculosis and all sorts of other highly contagious illnesses. And thank God it protects people pretty well. But it all depends on how well you're wearing it. So I tell people, if you're uncomfortable wearing an N95, it's not really going to help you that much. So maybe then wear one of the different N95s. There are different ones available. Find the one that works best for you. They're not that expensive anymore. They have the KF94 from Korea. That's sometimes people say it's a more comfortable mask. Can I guarantee that that's what you're actually getting? No, they're made out of the United States. And some studies have looked at this to show that there really isn't necessarily always you're getting what you paid for. So in the United States, if it says NIOSH approved on it, you can pretty much make sure that it's a kosher N95. Again, the KN95 from China, if it's truly a KN95, it probably will provide you with a little bit better protection than with a regular surgical mask. But a good surgical mask or 2 surgical masks are very good protection. If you feel that you need to be in that indoor space amongst other people, that's certainly something to do. Wearing eye protection, wearing goggles, sometimes possibly even a regular pair of glasses may give you an additional little bit of protection. In the hospital, we do insist that staff wear eye protection. Somehow that's not been reported at all in the press, that is a potential way that COVID could be spread. It's probably a very minor way. And there actually was one paper that showed that eyeglasses themselves, even without all the protection on the sides, may be slightly beneficial. So if you're unfortunate enough to need glasses, this is something positive. Or you want to wear some cool sunglasses or Secret Service type glasses, that may provide a little bit extra. If you're looking for every little bit of extra, so those are some of the things that you can do. And certainly distancing where possible. When I've been interviewed, so they'll use a big or they'll put on the lapel mic, as opposed to in the olden days just standing right next to me and we share the mic like this. So I think there are things that you can do that will minimize. I don't think you can ever eliminate the risk. But again, what risk are we talking about? If we're talking about the risk of, heaven forbid, getting very seriously ill, you can eliminate that to a very large extent by vaccinating. And I would say if anybody, heaven forbid, does have very serious underlying medical conditions, so then maybe that's the type of a person that would not be the best person to send to a crowded indoor location. You're going to a bar to film the Super Bowl, the crowd reaction to the Super Bowl, and there's 50 people in a space of 2 by 5, and that's probably not the best place for a person who's had a liver transplant who's a reporter. So maybe that's the time that you should be at the desk job, and somebody else should go in there. Again, I think that the best that you can ever ask for is to minimize or mitigate, limit risk. I don't think you can ever eliminate it.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So now I want to turn our attention, as our time is starting to wind down, to the post-COVID newsroom, and for Zach and Audrey, get your sense. Why don't we start with Audrey? What is your sense of what the newsroom might look like a year from now? And I say, obviously, emphasis on the word might, because a year ago, when I was thinking about it, none of what I thought this would be today turned out to be, true, obviously. So what's your sense of what's the future of the newsroom, and how has the pandemic changed the newsroom on a more permanent scale?
The second half is much easier than imagining a year from now. I gotta tell you, every time, I actually just had this conversation today with my boss. I said, every time he says, we're going back to the newsroom on such and such date, and that's gonna be it, and we're gonna be out of it, something happens. And there's so much we don't know yet about COVID. It changes, I'm hoping that we're in a better place. I think that there are a lot of things that probably will be kept in place. I would love nothing more to get all my anchors in the studio together again and have that family shot. I mean, I don't have big enough, the studios weren't built for 6 feet between 4 people. That's just wider than we got money for. But I imagine that a lot of things that we've learned that never would have broken through. I mean, I've worked, as you said at the beginning, at a lot of places. And the idea of a producer ever working from home was like, don't even bring it up. Work from home from editors, which can be done from home. We'd never do that. I think the ability to work from home and how we figured this out is something that will keep with us. It will open up, I hope, opportunities for us to get talent from not necessarily, that don't necessarily have to show up to the office every day. I think it might also expand opportunities for people who don't find being around their family 24 hours a day, 7 days a week craziness, but actually want that to be able to work from home instead of coming into the office. So that will expand our talent pool. I think that, as I mentioned before, not having reporters start their day back at the station just to have their presence known, but actually sending them so that they're they're more effective in their time. I think there's some good things we've actually learned. And I know we say this, we're in a communication business, but every place I've ever worked, we always say that nobody can communicate well. Like we're in a community when nobody knows what's going on. Nobody told this person that I was doing that, and we're both doing the same stuff constantly. We've had to learn to communicate better. Not great, but better. Because it's not just screaming across the room and hoping that somebody hears. So there's a lot of efficiencies. There's a lot of organization that I think we came out of it. But what this newsroom is going to look like, I can't tell you because this is so unpredictable. My dream is that we're back to somewhat normal with some positives. Will we have to live with masks? I don't know. It's been great for not getting a cold, but I still got COVID. But it's an unknown. I think it's more like what you hope that the newsroom is going to be. And I hope we get back to that community feel because there's a lot to be learned. And I do feel that our young journalists are missing out on that as those opportunities of overhearing a conversation, of grabbing one of the veterans and having kind of a quick conversation. They're missing those opportunities, and those made a significant difference in my life. And so I'd like to hope that we're back to a place where they could have that for their lives and their careers.
Yeah, I'd have to concur with you there. I think a lot of mentorship has been lost over the past 2 years, unfortunately. Zach, what's your sense? Where are we a year from now, and what does the future of the newsroom look like post-pandemic?
I think what Audrey said is, is really spot on. And I'd like to reiterate some of those things regarding the efficiencies and also the new kind of modes of operation that have popped up since COVID that we were forced to sort of move into. So for example, hybrid schedules. I imagine that, the newsrooms are no longer going to necessarily need to accommodate everyone on staff in the building at all times. That there will be people who may be better working remotely. There may be people who don't even live in the state who are able to work for newsrooms because it is efficient in many respects to have people working from remote and never or only rarely having to come into the office. So that's one thing I think which is here to stay, and we can thank, I guess, the coronavirus. If we can thank it for anything, we can thank it for that, for demonstrating that the technology is such that it can make this kind of thing happen. Those kinds of things were unthinkable previously, and yeah, there was always the sense that people they wanted butts in seats. They wanted to be able to see the whole staff together at some point for the meetings and for the for the sense of camaraderie, but also for sort of taking stock of where things were and sharing information. Now that's happening over Zoom. Now that's happening more so over Slack and more over phones. And maybe Audrey's right that there are people are communicating, if not better, certainly more often, because of the fact that we must now communicate through this way. We can't rely on the sort of passing contact that you may have at the water cooler in the cafeteria. That's not going to happen anymore. I imagine newsrooms are going to be cutting down on the amount of space that they themselves want to occupy. You may not need to be in as big a building as you had been before, or occupying fewer spaces. So I think it's going to, kind of change that dynamic, and hopefully there's maybe we move into a sort of a situation where we may never go back to where we were before. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but I do think that these innovations are here to stay in some respect, and maybe permanent, and some more permanent and more widespread in some newsrooms than in others. So again, it's hard to predict for a year from now, but some of these things I think are feeling that they're going to be permanent mainstays of the newsrooms.
Talking to our panelists as managers, and I'm wondering, especially in Nassau now where mask mandates are lifted, have reporters or employees ever refused to cover potentially risky assignments? And do you have a policy in place to address that?
I can answer that. Yes. And I also we have a couple of things going on. Once we have press conferences that require vaccination. So I can't send a certain amount of my population. It's a small population, but still I can't send them to cover it because that's a risk. And on the personal side, yes. In fact, we've told our reporters that if you go into a situation where it feels uncomfortable, people are unmasked, you feel unsafe, call the assignment desk. Do not go in. No story is worth it. And we've encouraged it. We've said that at our all hands meetings before. I'd rather miss the story than put somebody at risk to getting sick. We do give out masks freely in the newsroom. We also give out heavier duty masks if somebody wants those. We have those available to them, like several different options. Some people have a hard time breathing in them. If they're in a car, they have to wear them. We go out for weather. And we had that shot in the car that drives people nuts, but it's cool. We have them wear masks. They have to wear masks both on camera and off camera. It's not like pull it off for being on camera. You're not 6 feet apart from the person driving. Who are you fooling? Like, must wear. And Chris Vaccaro can say that I've actually called people after seeing them on live shots going, no, you have to be wearing a mask. So look, so to your question is, yes, we provide gear. And yes, if they are concerned, walk away.
Okay.
So that's where we're at.
And Zach,
You just
what do
know, as a reporter, that's got to be rough because we're inbred to be team players, and we feel like we're letting down the side and we're letting down our viewers and listeners if we don't expose ourselves to risk. So you've got to be a psychologist, I'm sure.
Well, at the same time, look, you're human. You're not impenetrable. And if it makes you uncomfortable, I don't want you uncomfortable in your job. This is a story. There'll be another story. Or maybe we just tell the story instead of going inside. I don't need the video. And we ask our assignment desks to work with people to find out if there's another solution. But again, it's not just you going out in the field and getting that story. You go home to your family. And this is different than anything else because it's not you taking the risk. You're taking the risk on behalf of everybody else you come in contact with. And that's the way we've looked at it. And that's the approach we've taken with it.
No,
Zach, is
great.
there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, those are great points, and I think this is the time to speak up for yourself. You don't want to endanger yourself, you don't want to endanger others, and this is one of the roles that a union does play. When we're dealing with workplace hazards and things that would really jeopardize a reporter or any other employee's life, and that's one of the things we pride ourselves on, is trying to speak up on behalf of the employees who may be younger or don't have the same sense of courage to confront a manager to say, hey, listen, I don't feel comfortable doing this assignment. We like to think that we speak for them there, but to the degree many other people are not unionized, but this is the time to speak up for yourself and really be an advocate, because the consequences can be pretty dire for you and for everyone else. So I reiterate what Audrey was saying.
And I have, David has a follow-up question for Dr. Glatt, which is an interesting question on messaging. Will the medical community seek to hire English majors to help get out the messages that you and the medical community are obviously looking to get out?
So I was an English minor in college, so I guess we need an English major. I do think that the messaging is something that individual doctors aren't necessarily responsible for. I was really thinking more of public health messaging from the very top. And every statement that Anthony Fauci makes, that Rochelle Walensky makes, is, viewed with a microscope. And I think they have learned, and they need to know, that every time they make a statement, it can't be a casual remark, because there's no such thing as a casual remark. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about official documents to come out. I believe they need to be better vetted. I do think that when you put out a document on isolation and then 5 days later, there's an uproar in the scientific circles about a document, that maybe those types of documents should be sent to the scientific people. Send them to the Infectious Disease Society of America membership. They got some pretty bright people there that aren't necessarily, quote, party line, and you can get different opinions in a collegial, non-combative, forum. I think we become so red and blue, and we become so polarized, that there still is room for consensus, and not every document is absolute. In the hospital, when I put together policies, I always like to frame them as guidelines and not absolutes, because there are almost always exceptions to the policies that we put into place. There needs to be room for exceptions. There are always individual scenarios that need to be taken into consideration, and absolutes are difficult to bend. And I do think that sometimes we scratch our heads when some of these pronouncements come out from, very good public health organizations. And again, I'm not knocking them. What I'm saying is that this is a different world. In the olden days, if Anthony Fauci had said something, you wouldn't hear about it. It wouldn't make the news. It would be a conversation that he had amongst other scientists at a meeting. They would say, "You're crazy, Anthony," or they would say, "Wow, that's a good idea." And somebody else would say, "Well, no, I disagree with that." And there would be a conversation. Today, the minute it's said, boom, that's it. It's now policy. It's now, this is the official CDC position. And people, they're sometimes afraid to say that they were wrong. I always used to joke, I think I'm the only physician that ever wrote in their chart on a very regular basis, what I said yesterday is incorrect. I've changed my mind. And that's because of new information that came in, or that was a pretty good idea yesterday, but based upon the new test results that came in, that no longer is a viable option, and therefore I'm changing. I've never been sued, thank God. And I think it's okay to say you're wrong. I was always taught that the sign of somebody is a great person is the sign of a person that can say I was wrong. And I think sometimes in this pandemic, people get so fixed on what was said and they can't back down. People can't say, okay, we made a mistake. There's nothing wrong with saying we made a mistake.
Okay, good. And I see that Joe Calderon who is a vice president at Mount Sinai South Nassau, where Dr. Glatt is at, has his hand up. I'm sure you want to weigh in on this question.
Yeah, I was just going to comment to Dr. Glatt. That's why you don't need English majors. That's why you have PR guys and ladies.
That's right.
You have former
PR guys majored in.
former newspaper people who can help you with your English.
But
actually, Dr. Glatt's English is very good. I'll have to say.
Right, he was an English minor, so that you can't beat that. That's a pretty powerful combination, English and medicine.
Hey, I'll just chime in real quickly and say I think you guys should take a break and give yourself some credit. It's been very difficult for everyone in the health field, on the PR side, but also obviously you folks are on the front line as well. And overall, when you look at it for the last 2 years, I think you've kept it going, and you've been continuing to report the news, and it's been difficult, and everybody's had to adjust, but you're getting the story out. I mean, you gotta give yourself some credit for that.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Everybody needs to give themselves a little pat on the back, right? Okay, we have a question here from Howard Cannon for Audrey. Earlier in the pandemic, TV was pulling coverage that has been discontinued. Why? And should that be resumed?
You know what, I can't really speak to that because when I got involved a year ago at News 12, that wasn't happening. And I don't know that we were part of that pool. So I can't speak to that. I wish I could speak to more, but a lot of the way we cover things is different from the big city stations. So there isn't a lot we could do. We do pull the governors. We do pull the big stuff that's still going on. We're not sending our own cameras to get it. We take the pool feeds of the big press conferences. So that kind of pooling is still going on. And the individual stories, News 12 is known for hyper-local coverage. So we're not going to cover the same things the same way as the city stations would necessarily. But I do see that the other questions about knocking on doors like they used to in the pandemic. Journalists, at least my investigative teams are still meeting with their sources, not necessarily in person, but they're doing it over Zoom. Means you got to have a phone call, but they're finding other ways to keep those sources going. We've had a couple of breakthrough investigations even during the pandemic. Again, it's just finding another way to do things, a different way of meeting with your sources, a different way of making contact with them than in person, or having the meeting 6 feet apart. Actually, I just had an investigative reporter called me while we were on this because they just finished an in-person meeting with a source at a coffee shop in the cold outside, even though they were both vaccinated because they want. So they're still having the in-person meetings. If you really want a story, most of my journalists and most other journalists will do whatever it takes to get there. So I don't think that's changed. Carl Bernstein may know one way of doing it, but in this internet age, they're doing Instagram, TikTok. I mean, we're meeting with people in totally different ways. You don't need to, some of the best sources aren't coming from the old traditional knocking on doors. I think we have a different way to knock on doors with apps and the internet and modern tools that have replaced it with or without a pandemic.
Excellent. Zach, and what is your sense on that question, whether or not traditional shoe leather journalism is going to suffer in any way in the coming years?
No, I imagine that there's always going to be a form of that. And again, we're seeing that when people go to scenes and talk to witnesses on the scene of events, it may again be a lot less necessary, but at the same time, I think that its value still can't be overstated. There's definitely going to be a place for that still, but you know, it's just we have more tools at our disposal these days, and maybe the pandemic sort of opened that that window into other ones, or created the need for other ones. Necessity breeds invention, so to speak. So I still think that you know, it's hard to disagree with Carl Bernstein to begin with, but he makes a good point. But at the same time, I think that that's going to certainly survive. The pool reporting, I mean, there's always been a place for that, for just for logistical purposes, and maybe there was more use of it. I didn't realize that it had increased and stopped. So it's, you know, it's news to me. But I see that maybe because there's been fewer people who, more people that is who are vaccinated, you're able to take some more risk. I mean, as Dr. Glatt was saying, if you're double vaccinated and also boosted, et cetera, you're minimizing the risk. So I think that we're going to move back to a more traditional form, but there may be some sort of safeguards in place where you won't, since it's not always necessary to be there in person, people will take advantage of those time periods. But I think that you probably still can't replace that face-to-face contact.
Okay, great. Well, I love that question, Brendan, in part because it's near and dear to my heart. Shoe leather journalism is one of the classes. I teach that as part of my advanced reporting class. I'm sure, Zach, you do as well at Stony Brook. And I can tell you that my students do, and our young reporters at the Herald do embrace the concept of it, and do, you know, certainly do, you know, practice shoe leather journalism, despite us being in a more technological age. It's still very much practiced. And I know that you definitely practice that out at the Southampton Press. So I think it's still out there and still alive, and I think we'll be fine as a profession. Okay. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up? Because we're just 2 minutes past 8 o'clock, which means we're right on schedule. I like to be on schedule.
You know, Scott, I don't want to drag this out, but something I am curious about, and I'll point to the fact that a few years ago, I worked for patch.com and we were remote. I worked remotely for
Correct.
3 years. There was not an office to go into.
Right.
And I'm sure that made the pandemic and working remote easy transition for that company that other companies did struggle with.
Yeah.
So, but offices themselves are incredible overhead, right? Heating those buildings, lighting those buildings, parking garages, security. I imagine that if you have a newsroom that doesn't own their building and they're at the end of a lease, they're looking for a smaller, cheaper place, because they can now save that money and they could spend it on personnel, i.e. reporters, rather than on a physical space. I wonder if that's a good thing for journalism, or are we going to miss those bigger office buildings, those bigger conference rooms?
Well, that's a good question. Zach and Audrey, what are your sense there?
I don't know. I would really miss the interaction with people. And look, for me, again, I'm in a different sort of field. I need studios. Like, I need a building. I need studios. I need edit room. So like, I'm different than a newsroom, and different than patch.com, because you can't replicate a big studio to the same degree. So I think it's a hybrid of both for the future. And I think there's a lot to be learned, and maybe, you know, we have to see how this goes. I do hope that we don't lose some of the progress we have on work from home and other sorts of ways to make it work. Maybe it's not as big to space, but I don't see a studio going away yet, but who knows? Technology will tell, as everything else.
Zach, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think, you know, Brendan's point is spot on. I alluded to that earlier, that, you know, you just won't need these sort of large buildings for journalism outlets anymore. We're talking primarily print, but I think you're correct that if you're at the end of your lease, you're gonna be like, well, listen, you know, do we need all these spaces? Because some people are going to be on hybrid schedules where they may be in there 20% of the time, for example, and the people will sort of be rotating in and out. You just you never really will need 100% of your staff in the same building at the same time. So you don't need as much space because you don't have to accommodate all of them at the same time. So I imagine the more innovative folks are going to say, we can cut some overhead here, and at least for, the next 3 to 5 years, or however you ever to put a lease together, let's maybe only rent 50% of the space that we used to rent before. And, we can, we'll deal with it. We'll deal with it. We can use more remote tools. So I think that you're quite correct. I imagine that people are doing that right now. Yes.
The hospital will be happy to take any of that real estate off your hands and build private practices there.
There you go. Well, there you go.
Right.
Okay. I could see that as a possibility. Okay, so I think that's a wrap, unless we have any other questions. Oh, great. So
Thank you all for giving us the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank our guests, certainly Audrey, Zach, Dr.
Thank you.
Glatt. It was
My
wonderful
pleasure.
having you. You were great fonts of information. So we definitely appreciate your time, taking the time out of your very busy schedules to be with us tonight. And I certainly learned a lot. I reminded myself of all of the important things. So I think this was a great talk. And I'll throw it back to Brendan.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, panelists. You've been great. This is very enlightening. This is really exactly what we wanted this event to be. We do have more events planned in February. We are planning an event where we're going to examine how the media has covered America's 21st century conflicts. Being out of Afghanistan now, it's a time to reflect. And then coming up in March, we are looking at having this remotely, but it could possibly still be in person depending on how the pandemic goes. But there is the Region 1 conference, which is either going to be remote or it's going to be at Hofstra University. So that's New York and New England Society of Professional Journalists chapters combined. And we have a lot of fun events planned. Please watch pcli.org for more. In April, we're planning an event that I think is going to be very useful for journalists and publishers alike, which is all going to be about using materials that may or may not be copyrighted and how to recognize whether you truly have permission to use a provided photograph or video, and for the photographers and videographers among us, how they can protect their copyright when they do find that they've been infringed upon. Again, pcli.org. That's where you find all of our information. You could also follow us on social media. We love hearing from you. You could reach out to us at pressclubofli@gmail.com. Have a great night, everybody. And thank you, Scott, for moderating. You were perfect.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.